So, the thing I'd like to talk about today is an explanation of how the biology of belief plays into the nonsensical phenomenon of SJW behavior that we see today, and how ultimately SJW thinking is a logical progression, as much as anything can be logical in terms of a human being, from religious thinking, faith based thinking of sorts, belief in mythology, to the modern day supposedly secularized worldview. And I'm going to attempt to explain to you why actually a secularized worldview is actually impossible. A purely secular worldview is impossible, how it defies the nature of both biology and, through biology, the physical universe, through the medium of the biological mediation of perception, and how I'm going to attempt to explain as well how these situations that we are intrinsically a part of due to our fundamental biology are producing the SJW phenomenon, the climate change phenomenon, and many other phenomenon that people see that aren't that where they will claim scientific authority but don't actually seem to have it. If you go looking for it, it's not there, or the science doesn't prove what it says it's supposed to prove. It just shows correlations. So, firstly, why did people make religion, and what does it mean that we don't have religion anymore? Okay, so people made religion mostly because it's impossible for any one person to have all the data. And you can imagine on the trek from being chimps, being, proto-humans, to being the creatures we see before us, there were a lot of evolutionary steps that are memes, like Richard Dawkins' idea of a meme, had to undergo in order to get to the point where we were capable of even understanding the scientific worldview. So basically what ends up happening is people create stories, and these stories turn into religious stories over long spans of time. They sort of evolve into a story that doesn't have to make rational sense but is adapted to the environment. And then what ends up happening is these stories are the way our brain evolved to perceive reality, and the social context. A lot of the religious stories are actually social rules. And the reason for this is if you follow the social rules, there are also rules about how to act in nature, like dietary restrictions and whatnot. And if you follow the social rules, it gives you a better chance of surviving in a Darwinian sense, of your genes surviving, of the tendency to be religious and to have faith in these ideas, in these rules that work from a material perspective. So you can see how religious stories and faith evolved over time. Now, faith is actually a necessity, and a secular worldview is technically impossible in the way that Newtonian mechanics describe. Why is this? This is because... Okay, so there's a problem of the infinity of the world in relationship to the finitude of the human experience. So human experience is always finite. The world is always, as far as we can tell, infinite. It's infinite at every scale. Every tiny little speck of reality that we can perceive with our bodies it goes down into infinity and scales upwards to infinity as well. So because reality is fundamentally impossible to understand, if you don't have axiomatic assumptions that you're unwilling to question, you end up in an infinite regress. And because it takes a certain amount of energy to form new ideas, the brain uses 20% of the calories in the body. If you don't have faith in something, if you don't take something for granted, you fall into an infinite energetic regress and die. So it is possible to, in the Kierkegaardian phrase, drowning complexity. It is a biological possibility that people use faith to avoid. So whether that's logical or not doesn't really matter, because in order for there to be logic, there has to be life. and in order for life to exist, it has to have faith, otherwise it falls into an infinite regress, can't calibrate its brain in relationship to the environment, and it dies, meaning that there would be no life, meaning that there could be no logic. So, that's basically why we need faith. Faith gives rise to religious stories. Religious stories give rise to science, because eventually people start developing enough of a focus on truth in order to self-reflect and seek the truth about the natural world, which effectively leads to philosophy of science and therefore science. Now, the problem that people have made in this couple last centuries is replacing science with religion and casually disregarding religion on the grounds of its illogical nature. Now, as I've said, it actually doesn't matter whether religion is illogical or not. People are not capable of being 100% logic. People are logical. People are capable of logic. However, this does not mean that logic is the ultimate pinnacle of human achievement. For instance, logical systems such as Nazism can be morally wrong and corrupt and lead to the deaths of millions of people. Although, if you take the initial axioms to be 100% true, and it depends what you mean by true, Nazism is a logically coherent philosophy. Actually, in most systems of human abstract thought, in most compositions of human abstract thought, if you take the initial axioms to be true, then everything works logically. This does not mean that every system of belief is equally true. It just means that logic can serve many masters. Now, the problem I see in our current society is twofold, and I'll get to the SJW thing in a second. People have disregarded the notion of faith as a naive concept when it's actually a biological necessity and therefore a logical necessity, at least from the standpoint of human beings. Secondly, the notion of rationality and logic independent from human bodies and material desires, which science strives to achieve, is actually based on a religious notion of the human soul, or the Socratic daemon. So Socrates, the Greek philosopher, had a experience of having a disincarnate daemon inside his head that would tell him what not to say. And this daemon is the root word of the word democracy and demographics and all this stuff. It's also where we get the idea of the soul and where we get the idea of the psyche. Soul is, in Greek, is psyche, psychology. That's basically the etymological linkage there. And so the idea of pure abstract logic is it's effectively, it's based on religious notions. So that's one problem, is that there's a deep philosophical confusion in science where scientists will always have axioms that they're unable to or unwilling to question. And if you poke them in the axioms, you find that they're actually as irrational as any religious person. This is why I think flat earthers are so funny, because they've constructed a logical worldview with initial axioms that are different than science, and science hates them. And when you start poking scientists using flat Earth, the flat Earth system, they get really angry and they act like Lawrence Krauss, who's a PhD in physics, and he tells people to go kill themselves if they believe in flat Earth, which I think is the most hilarious thing that a lot of people, nobody gets why that's funny. But the reason it's funny is because science is based on logical axioms, and flat Earth is based on different logical axioms. And if the fundamental axioms get questioned and somebody's not a philosopher of science, a philosopher of theory, and they're just a proponent of one particular ideology, they're not going to be able to cope with the fact that a different set of axioms exist, they're going to casually dismiss it, strawman it, and attack it violently, even. And you see this with YouTube censoring flat Earth content and all this stuff. Okay, now how does this relate to the SJW movement? So, in the absence of religious faith, let's say, it doesn't even have to be religious. In our secular societies, in the way it demonizes faith, people still need moral guidance because you can't live without a morality. And effectively, what these SJW people are trying to do is they're developing a binary worldview between oppressor and oppressed, and this could be in the form of trans people, it could be in the form of black people in America, it could be in the form of any person who's a perceived outgroup, right? And they're violently defending them and with religious fervor because they need that moralistic force in their lives to keep them going. Like, our morality tells us what to do, and what we do keeps us alive. Like, life is a process of action. It's not a process of static being. Everything we do, from our visual systems to our motivations to our positive emotion systems, is grounded in action. It's grounded in perception of a goal. Now, the problem with demonizing faith at an institutional level, which our society has done, is that it leaves a vacuum of meaning, and people find that meaning in trying to create an egalitarian world, which can't happen because people aren't equal. And in order to, like, at an individual level, people are not equal. So in order to create an egalitarian world, you would have to basically kill everyone. So that's basically how the lack of religion leads to SJW type behavior and virtually all the other oversimplified representations of moral structure that you see today from the right or the left.